Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ursula Carmichael, and I am a liaison librarian here in Rare Books and Special Collections at McGill Libraries. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to our seminar room here at RBSC. I'm very glad you all found it. And thanks very much for joining us for today's recording of a panel discussion on the life and work of Dr. Barbara Althea Jones. We welcome and ask for respectful engagement and participation in this space today, and we may have some time at the end for some questions from the audience after our panel discussion as well. Bonjour à toutes et à tous, je suis ravie de vous accueillir ici dans notre salle de séminaire dans le département de Rare Books and Special Collections des bibliothèques de McGill pour l'enregistrement d'une table ronde à propos de la vie et l'œuvre de Barbara Althea Jones. Nous vous remercions tous de votre présence et nous invitons et demandons la participation respectueuse dans cet espace aujourd'hui. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the history and context of the land on which this event is taking place. The land where McGill stands has long served as a site of meeting and exchange for Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We honor, recognize, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. They are also the stewards of the knowledge that is specific to this place, the kind that is difficult to list in a library catalog or to describe in an archival finding aid. I am grateful to live and work on this land and to be able to attend this panel with all of you here today. So before we continue, I will say just a few words about RBSC at McGill Libraries. So Rare Books and Special Collections works to support teaching, learning, and research at McGill University in Montreal and in the wider scholarly community through various activities, including outreach. So we are grateful to have the opportunity to support such an important conversation exploring the work of a still under-recognized geneticist and poet, particularly since she was a part of the McGill community. The collection at RBSC is largely comprised of materials in the humanities and the social sciences, but there are also significant rare book collections in biology and the history of science. The disciplinary breadth and range of the collections housed at RBSC makes a seminar room space a fitting place to talk about the life and work of a person who lived, researched, and created in many ways across traditional disciplinary demarcations. I would now like to invite Professor Miranda Hickman of the Department of English at McGill University and the Director of the Poetry Matters Initiative, also the lead organizer of this panel today, to begin our panel with an introduction to the Poetry Matters Initiative. Miranda?
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much, Ursula. And thank you to McGill Rare Books and Special Collections and McGill University Archives. With McGill Rare Books and Special Collections and McGill University Archives, the Poetry Matters Initiative at McGill is very glad to gather people today for a panel conversation on the work of Barbara Althea Jones, a poet, geneticist, and also professor of genetics at McGill in the late 1960s, whose work, as Ursula just mentioned, is still largely unrecognized, but whose multidimensional work is fortunately just now starting to be acknowledged through the work of people here today. Jones was born in Trinidad, pursued graduate work in plant genetics at Cornell University in the United States, where she received her doctorate in 1965, and subsequently came up to McGill for a postdoctoral fellowship, after which time she was hired as an assistant professor in 1968. Jones's papers are housed at McGill University Archives, and after discovering information on Barbara Jones through the McGill Library and in McGill's University Archives last year, Poetry Matters has been pursuing research on Barbara Jones's life and work. So that's how this event has come about. Let me introduce briefly our guests for today's session. Thank you to all of you for being here today. We are delighted to welcome Shanice Nicole Yard, who is a spoken word artist, poet, educator, and at McGill, Associate Director, Anti-Racism and Equity Education at McGill University, who will be reading some of Jones's poetry. We'd like to welcome a colleague from Concordia University in Montreal, Dr. Nalini Mohabir, professor in the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment at Concordia, who works in Caribbean studies, indentured labor, post-colonialism, decolonization, diaspora, protest and resistance. We'd like to welcome Dr. Alison Donnell, Head of Humanities and Professor of Modern Literatures at the University of Bristol. Thank you for traveling all this way to be with us today, who works in Caribbean literature, especially on the recovery of women authors and Caribbean literary archives. I'm Miranda Hickman, Professor of English at McGill, where I work primarily on modernist poetry through the lens of feminist archival research. I'm co-founder and director of the Poetry Matters Initiative, which is essentially a network of students, faculty, and poets working together to create spaces for poetry and conversation on poetry. We change form and move into different genres of work every year. And this season, although in the past we've done workshops and readings, we've begun a research arm on poets associated with McGill and Montreal. So that's where this has come from. Speaking on their research today as part of Poetry Matters are Jayda Smith and Avryl Bender, who are students at McGill who have been pursuing research on Barbara Althea Jones over the past year as part of an internship with the Poetry Matters Initiative, sponsored by McGill's Arts Internship Office and the Dean of Arts Development Fund. And that leads me to warm thanks I would like to extend for support of this event to Equity at McGill, McGill University Archives, McGill Rare Books and Special Collections, the Arts Internship Office at McGill, the Dean of Arts Development Fund, to historian David Austin, with whom we consulted about Barbara Jones and the contexts in which she worked in Montreal. And we'd like to extend thanks to Gwendolyn Owens, director of the Visual Arts Collection at McGill, with whom we also consulted during the summer internship, whose research on Cornell University in the 1960s shed a great deal of light on Jones's time at Cornell. And we would also like to extend warmest thanks to Joy Onyejiako, niece of Barbara Jones, for generous support as Poetry Matters pursued this research journey in the archives. Let me say a little bit more about our panelists for today. Dr. Nalini Mohabir is professor in the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment at Concordia. She teaches in the fields of feminist and post-colonial migration geographies, and her research is primarily in the field of Caribbean studies, with a focus on indentureship, protest, and resistance. Among recent publications is The Fire That Time, Transnational Black Radicalism and the Sir George Williams Occupation, edited with Ronald Cummings. Dr. Alison Donnell is head of Humanities and professor of modern literatures and English at the University of Bristol. She has published widely in the field of Caribbean literature with significant contributions to the fields of literary history and culture, recovery research of women authors, and Caribbean literary archives. Her book, Lost and Found, an A to Z of neglected writers of the Anglophone Caribbean, will be published soon in May, and I hope, Alison, you'll have a chance to speak to that today. Shanice Nicole Yard is a Black educator, facilitator, writer, an outspoken word artist, and mother based in Montreal. She primarily works at McGill as the Associate Director, Anti-Racism and Equity Education. Outside of McGill, Shanice facilitates and educates in various learning spaces, coordinates the scholarship program for the Black Foundation of Community Networks, and curates free resources such as Jobs and Things and All Black Everything Montreal. She is also author of her debut children's book, Dear Black Girls, published in 2021 by Metonymy Press. Jayda Smith is an honors English literature student at McGill with a minor in Caribbean and Latin American studies. As a Belizean, she has gained immense appreciation for the lens her cultural heritage has afforded her and its influence on her interpretations of Dr. Jones's archival materials. Avryl Bender is in her last semester of the honors English literature program at McGill with a minor in French language and literature. She plans to go on to a master's program to further pursue interests in Canadian literature, poetry, and archival studies. So let me then turn things over to the people here. First, let me turn to Shanice Nicole Yard for reading some poetry from Barbara Althea Jones, much of which derives from her 1967 publication, Among the Potatoes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Miranda, and thank you so much to you and to Nalini for the invitation. It's such an honor to be here and to be able to read this poetry. So there will be, I want to say 6, maybe 7 pieces. And we will start with the first, titled My Sister. Low to a cold and bitter land she fled, among strange faces, white faces. There midst those cold and ancient ones she wed, among strange faces, a black face. And in the coldness there she bore a child, among strange faces, white faces. Thence from the coldness, yes, she sped to warmth, among strange faces, black faces. But now the memory of the cold is gone, among strange faces, warm faces. And now the memory of the warmth is gone, amidst those faces, black faces. So swiftly, with one swoop of death, life ended, among strange faces, black faces. And in the cold and clammy earth, she's lying among strange graves, black graves. My sister. The next piece is called The Bridges. How often have you seen a bridge? How often have I seen a bridge? But never, ever have you seen a bridge with a body dead beneath its bed. The sadist grip the vice set in, each bridge was checked for. What it was and what it wasn't, what was in it. The strange obsession, prepossession of the meaning of a bridge. Schizophrenic unity of the real, unreal reality to it wedded, gaping chasm down beneath, turbid waters of psychotic fight and grief. Horizontal phallus laced with life, projecting into warm and womby pleasure into time, bringing close together heaving breasts of space, with watery beads between the throbbing sides that now are one. East aloof and west unwon, bridge unspanned beneath, between them, mental chasm in between them, violent waves of ideology, unreached, unleashed. Wizened age looked over the time. On the other side she saw the wet and diapered youth sprawled on the floor. Gossamer suspension, bridge of life between them, lay and does today. That was The Bridges. And I'm not sure if I can, anyways, I'll share it, but Nalini was sharing with me that some of the poetry of Dr. Jones had like erotic elements, and so some poems were like locked in a cabinet, I guess so that people would not be enticed to read them. So it's so interesting how that, continues in many ways. But people will always find the poetry, find the words. The next is called The World. The world is full of squares, round squares, angular squares, and square squares. The world is full of sharp needles that prick and hurt, sharp needles. Why all the work, invention, thought would soon be maggots, havoc wrought. To hate the world would be unfair. The world is far too dumb to care. To sink into the world of drink, 'tis not too dignified, I think. To seek the endless somnia of drugs is a far too painless kind of jug. In dreams I see a tractor green, make strawberry jelly with my spleen. I could not move or scream or yell. It had no warning sound or bell. In dreams I saw my frozen head swing underneath the bridge's bed. The world is black and white and green, full of potato plants, it seems, Full of black faces, all are mine. Full of white faces, all are thine. Full of potato plants, it seems. The world is black and white and green. The next piece is called Academia. Very fitting. Ivy tower, red bricks, academia. Gray skies, brown trees, in winter. Bookworms for terms, no thoughts. So bored of knowledge, stored and canned. Who thinks, who needs the exercise? Oh, money down the intellectual drain. And still the collar blue we envy. The happiness, the mediocrity we wish. Too late, the bridge is drawn. There's no return to mediocrity. We're hooked. The next piece is called Leroy Jones. Skin brother, angry odors of hate cloud out the beauty and pathos of golden images. Skin brother, vivisect the whole, amputate cancerous bitterness, and leave prophetic morsels for immortality. Skin brother, believe me, your greatness, rain droplets of sensitivity, which caress the ear. Read us, skin brother, for we read you. The next piece is called Land of the Night, Land of the Sea, and is 3 parts. Part 1. Land of the night and of the darkness, you are not my land. Land with the trees hanging in grotesque shapes of winter, with the valleys covered with the snows which alienate me, you are not my land. Land of a fabric made of cars, land of a mission off to Mars, land of the stripes and race and stars, you are not my land. Part 2. I should not now persist the thought, the brown thought to conceal. I should not now pretend that there is something to reveal. That land of night, she was my mother, a foster mother in the bookworm fight. Land of the night, foster mother in a purple time, whose milk was to me sour in the first phases in the volumed book. Land of the night, whose people, rainbow, a violet, orange of the blue-green thought. Thoughts of liberty and freedom, whose freedom? Cloud is seen but never felt. Land of the night, 5 and 60 lunar months, I stayed with you, foster mother. Land of the night, I hate you and I love you. Love you for the red love of fight, for the gory battles of technology you've won, for moneyed miracles of computers which have indexed me and filed me. But land of the night, I hate you. For my people of the black and burnished skin who, from the banks of the Niger, who from the land of Kilimanjaro, who from the alligatored warmth of the green forests you did bring my cousins who from their lion cultures, who are the seed of Adam, who were the pride of Africa, whom you crushed. My uncles who had a civilization of medieval excellence, who cannot hate your rancid greed, who will not give in, but will bleed. Land of the night, my shackled sibs whose children now are fighting, for whose sisters are now shouting, for whose brothers now are sitting, for whose amici are helping too, to give them freedom that they knew. Land of the night and of the darkness, foster mother, I hate you and I love you. I know you are not my land. Part 3. Land of the sea and the sun and the blue, waters warm, which are green, from the shadows of the lumid trees. Land of the sea and the sun, my spirit calls for you, a spirit wistful as a tropic breeze which ripples o'er an oyster bed. Land of the sea and the sun, where palm trees tiptoe up to heaven, where the night is filled with the mystery of a living zoo, where the streets are lined with golden people of an Eldorado hue, where the masters once the whipping posts had, where the Spanish governors and the French spat words at one another, where once Christopher had landed and had left, where my Carib ancestors were slaughtered in their rests, where my mother's mother's mother had been tortured on the living ant hills of her time, where my father's father's father had been fired like a ram, where the yellows, browns, and blacks across the murky seas had died to live, land of the sea and the sun, land of a muted, molten culture that is now, land of my mother, land of my father, land of my sibs. You I have loved, and you I shall love. And the final piece is a song for children. I have to lift up the paper because it's from the reporter and it's really small. In the catacombs of the city and the bridges of the past lay breathing, gold for their eyes, bread their stomachs, and housetops of desire, slated and gray, do not awake their feet. In the castles of the air built high on psychedelic sips, no one sees the harshness of their concrete lives. No one, no one. I beg of you, my children of this century, open your eyes, open them and stop the catacombs from filling, the castles from crumbling, the centuries from dying. Yesterday the trees went to battle with the rain, gray Montreal, bleak London. The world is dying, my children. Save it. Rigor mortis has set in. 500 obsolete Mustang, Chevy, Chrysler Imperial convertibles collided with 3 motorbikes. No one was hurt. No one saw them crumble. Apple shortbread on the streets of Paris. Awake, my children. 5 million of your brothers lay dying in the rice fields, paddy in their mouths, the food of death, a food for death. Green and pregnant with grain, 500 million ghosts will haunt the White House. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you, Shanice, very much. That was really beautiful to hear out loud. So the title of our panel today is Defying Season. Although this line was taken from a poem in Among the Potatoes that describes a hibiscus hedge, it could also be applied to Jones herself as someone who defied time and season. Jones was the first Caribbean woman to earn a PhD in plant genetics, and she was also among the first Black female professors at McGill University. As Professor Hickman mentioned already, by 1965, Jones had to earn her master's at PhD from Cornell University, where she researched a species of potatoes that had been under research at the time because it was resistant to a certain kind of pest. And then in 1967, Jones published her first collection of poetry, Among the Potatoes, from which we heard a number of poems just now. However, we know from Jones's CV that she had a number of works on the press at the time of her passing in 1969. So on the next slide, there's an image of her CV from the McGill University archives, and it has a list of some of those texts. Among the Potatoes, Mango Season, Letters to Emmons and Hewitts, Apples for the Children, Green Dragon, Summer Fire. For today's panel discussion, Jayda and I would like to foreground the interdisciplinary aspect of Jones's work for two reasons. First, because this feels like an accurate representation of Jones, who described herself on her CV as a geneticist by vocation, a poet by avocation. And also because in many ways her fonds require an interdisciplinary approach. We often encounter doodles and other indications of Jones's artistic work in the margins of her predominantly scientific notes housed at McGill University archives. And this is one example of that, which is it's placed on one of the tables. I'm not sure which one, if you want to look afterwards, just over here, okay. This is a lino cut of 6 that are included in among the potatoes, and we found it in between notes from her time at Cornell University when we were looking through her archives. And this is called Mother and Kings, or Mother and Child. Positioned in between notebooks on plant genetics, this lino cut represents much of the research that we did in the archives. Although our project has been to understand Jones's work as an artist, this particular archive has persistently reminded us that even if plant genetics is not our area of interest, that's a very important aspect of Jones's life, and it kind of forced us to have to look through all of her notes on potatoes, in addition to finding what we could about poetry, which was a really neat experience. The interdisciplinarity of Jones's work also expanded to performance art and Black activism. On April 28th in 1968, Jones performed an original poem, Chant of the Blacks, as part of Africa and the Caribbean at the Sadie Bronfman Center, which had just opened the year prior. This performance was directed by Jeff Henry, a future co-founder of the Black Theatre Workshop, still very active in Montreal today. To capture the history of colonialism in the Caribbean from slavery until now, Africa and the Caribbean featured a combination of folk music, chorus, and percussion, in addition to a variety of dance forms such as the belladere, the bongo, the kalinda, and the shango. Instead of writing a script, Henry explained that he wanted to bring together artists working in a variety of different mediums so that together they could demonstrate the diversity of the Caribbean. So here's the previous image is 3 of the performers, and Barbara Jones is on the right. And then this is also an overview of the performance, so it has a bit of background about the production, but this is available through the University of Toronto because the performance was done again about 9 years later. Henry met the cast of Africa and the Caribbean for 6 months leading up to the performance, not only to rehearse, but also to discuss 3 texts that he required the cast to read in advance of the performance. These texts included The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, as well as Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth and Black Skin, White Masks. In the fall of that year, Jones would read her poetry alongside Marilyn McConney and Clarence Bain for a drama workshop at the Caribbean Conference Committee's annual conference held at Sir George Williams, now Concordia University, which Jones was a panelist for the year before. Around this time, Jones would also publish 2 newspaper articles about racism in Canada and abroad. A Black Woman Speaks Out appears in the McGill Reporter in the fall, and then The Black Man in a White Society appears in January in the McGill News Alumni Magazine. Both of these pieces detail the CCC's annual conference and the Congress of Black Writers at McGill University. And in David Austin's book, Fear of a Black Nation, Austin describes the Congress as one of the most important gatherings of international Black radical and nationalist figures of the time, and also credits Jones's article with being one of the only detailed accounts of the Congress of Black Writers. When we think about Jones's article in the context of Africa and the Caribbean, it's interesting to note that Jones concludes A Black Woman Speaks Out by citing Frantz Fanon, who we know that she was reading for that performance. She concludes with, man is a yes, yes to life, yes to love, yes to generosity, but man is also a no. No to the scorn of man, no to the degradation of man, no to the butchery of what is most human in man, freedom. In A Black Man in a White Society, Jones invokes also the history of Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, which is the topic of the Black Jacobins. And C.L.R. James was also one of the speakers at the Congress of Black Writers. So on the next slide, you can see that the issue of the McGill Reporter that includes A Black Woman Speaks Out also features an interview with C.L.R. James and an excerpt of one of Jones's poems, which we just heard at the ends there, Song for Children. The Congress of Black Writers took place from October 11th to October 14th of 1968. And interestingly, these dates coincide almost exactly with the dates of another of Jones's performances, Uptight, at Review Theatre, which took place from October 10th to October 12th. This was directed by Arlie Peterson and included figures like Marilyn McConney and Cynthia Hendrickson alongside Barbara Jones's poetry. Given that figures like C.L.R. James and the Roy Jones were in Montreal for the Congress, it's interesting to imagine who might have been in the audience, though of course we have no way of knowing that. And then shortly after the Congress of Black Writers at McGill, Jones helped to organize a 4-day teach-in on racism at McGill University. And Jones spoke on the last panel of the teach-in entitled Black Revolution, Where Do We Go From Here? We know from Jones's fonds and of course her poetry, though, that she was thinking about activism before these conferences. One other interesting find in this archive is that Jones spent the summer in 1960 at the University of Berkeley studying fruit flies, and in one of the back of the notebooks that she has from that research, she drafts a letter to the Prime Minister at the time, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who had just been elected, where she we know also from letters that she was writing it because she lost her luggage and she was sitting in the Ottawa airport trying to sort that out. And in this letter, Jones questions the adequacy of current policies for both Black Canadians and for Black Canadian immigrants. While we do not know if Jones ever sent a letter to Trudeau, this draft anticipates some of the criticism that would surface in her article for McGill News. In the opening paragraph of the article, Jones writes, quote, "Canada is a vital part of this continent, and as such, she cannot sit back with smugness and hypocrisy and look at our neighbor in the south," end quote. Jones's criticism of racism in Canada becomes particularly prescient, too, when we recall that the 9th floor occupation at Concordia would take place only 1 month after she published this piece in McGill News. So now I'll pass it off to Jayda.
And perhaps Jones's ability to critique Canada and the US comparatively comes from the fact that she lived in both countries but was a native of neither. Her Trinidadian background very much informed her activism, art, and career. Evidence of this in one perhaps minor but entertaining archival document is projected. This was one of several of Dr. Jones's doodles interspersed across her notebooks during her time as a student at Cornell, 1960 to 65. I think it's nice to think about how even then, in the height of her academic journey, she was thinking of home and finding ways to represent it. Perhaps she was already thinking about performance art, as I see a few depictions of steel pans in like the corner over here. You can see the little dents in the top. That's like very telling that it's a drum, a steel pan drum. And if you're not unfamiliar with those, they're like super symbolic of Caribbean culture, and especially Trinidad because they came from Trinidad originally. There's also a little like dory boat depicted in the top, which again, if you're from the Caribbean, these are very familiar images: palm trees, coconut trees, little thatch roof houses. So it was a delight to see her thinking about these things even while she was doing the potato work and the fruit fly work. We have no way of knowing what Dr. Jones was thinking as she sketched this at the top of her notebook, but looking at it, it reminds me so much of the project of Africa and the Caribbean, which Avryl spoke to a bit, though this was a few years before its production. From her fonds here at McGill, we know a bit about the circle of professors and academics she would have come across, but articles like these, this one is from the Montreal Star, that speak to Jones's performance side gave us a look into those who may have been a part of her artistic and activist community. One such performer was Marilyn McConney. In one interview, she mentions that she comes from a country of strong folk influence, and she speaks to her great desire to communicate with people of all classes and races through the African West Indian art form. Like Jones, McConney demonstrates a desire to use her cultural background to speak to larger issues and form community. Avryl spoke earlier to the significance of African Caribbean and Jones's poem that was performed in it, Chant of the Blacks. In this newspaper clipping from the Montreal Star, McConney says the poem describes the situation in the West Indies as the neocolonials, Black men in power, continue to oppress their own people. I highlight McConney to point out how Black Caribbean women were very much a part of these political conversations and a part of the organizing and rallying. I'm thinking of a figure like Dominica-born Dorothy Wills, who played a huge role in the formation of various Black organizations and who frequently encouraged her community to fight for their causes, yet their names and faces don't appear alongside the greats of Black power movements. And even when these women's names and faces and works do appear in media, they are often sidelined, their work is often misconstrued, and their stories and experiences misrepresented. What was perhaps one of the most jarring things about our research on Dr. Jones was how irresponsible the media at the time was with her representation. It was rather disappointing to see the frequently demeaning and condescending vocabulary that was used by reviewers and journalists when they discussed Dr. Jones and her work. In a review of Africa and the Caribbean performed by Dr. Jones, Cynthia Bain, and Joan Roll, the women, all accomplished in their own right, whether in art or academia, are frequently referred to as girls by the journalist, top right corner. The journalist also comments that though the performers were working together for the first time, for the first time. They had previously known each other through the Montreal West Indies grapevine. This is a more trivial comment, but I find it very amusing because it's like this magical place where Caribbean people go to meet each other. It's like when I tell people I'm from Belize and they're like, oh, so you must know every Belizean at McGill. And it's like, well, yeah, but don't get too comfortable assuming that. But yeah, so if anybody knows where I can find the Montreal West Indies grapevine, let me know. But yeah, in a review of Uptight, which is the middle clipping here, performed in October 1968 in the Gazette, the reviewer comments on Chant of the Blacks, which is featured in the performance. Now, this is a poem about slavery and the far-reaching impacts of it on subsequent generations. The lines quoted are, "We are the sons of slaves, we are the daughters of slaves, we have had our tongues torn from our mouths and our babes torn from our breasts." While the reviewer makes no comments about the historical and political significance of these lines, she does seem to take issue with Jones's violent imagery. She used this word twice, once before and after the quoted lines. Critiquing the poem, she says, "Though extremely violent, it is hardly dramatic in any usual sense." She quotes the lines I mentioned and goes on, "This trend toward violent imagery is consistent in Miss Jones's poetry." She also finds it necessary to comment on how Jones's reading is not always fluent. Now, out of context, one might say that imagery of having tongues torn from mouths and babes from breasts is violent, but nothing about Jones's depiction of these scenes is out of context or without purpose. She is talking about slavery, a historical reality, and the atrocities inflicted upon those enslaved and their progeny. Not only are these descriptions of physical violence, but also metaphorical violence. Tongues torn from our mouths, read with any use of literary lens or dramatic ear, could be understood to refer to the way the voices and stories of oppressed peoples go unheard, stolen, and buried. All that to say, this was the kind of uncritical, prejudiced environment and gaze Dr. Jones faced in the realm of art, and most likely also within the realm of academia. She speaks to this kind of condescension and misinterpretation in an interview entitled "To Defeat Bigotry Here" from the Montreal Star. The article goes on to quote her, "But what a tiresome battle it is," she sighs, "to prove oneself." I include the, that's the top right corner, top left corner right there. I include the advertisement for hair dye because this was the ad that appeared on the same page as Jones's interview, in which she's talking about very serious topics, along with a furniture sale ad. Many of the articles and interviews that covered Jones were often surrounded by ads marketing feminine products and clothing, and we have discussed about whether this positioning might indicate something about how seriously Dr. Jones and her peers were regarded. Symptomatic readings of these archival materials, the kind of reading I would suggest that most marginalized people learn how to develop very early on, gives us insight into what kind of environment Dr. Jones would have been working in and how this could have perhaps influenced her politics, poetry, performance, and plant genetics. I bring out these two quotes to highlight the tension that exists within those of diasporic Caribbean experiences, a tension and question that Jones speaks to so well in her poetic voice, like in the poem Shanice so beautifully read for us, "Land of the Night, Land of the Sea." In one quote from the Montreal Star, Jones expresses frustration with the neo-coloniality of Trinidad's post-independence period. "There is still too much of a colonial atmosphere and not enough effort is made to keep the trained native technocrats. Here exists a desire to contribute to the growth of her country, but also a resigned frustration at having to look elsewhere for economic and personal opportunities. She says she tries her best, but eventually gives up. Though she leaves Trinidad again in 1966 and comes to Montreal, her life in Canada, despite the possible opportunities the move afforded her, seems to be no less complex and difficult. Not because of the economic and political stagnancy that sometimes comes with living in the Caribbean, but because of racial discrimination and condescension that comes with being a Black Caribbean woman, an immigrant in the 60s, and right now, but another day, another panel." In another portion of the article, she speaks about her more recent poetry and how many are in dialect. "I find dialects very beautiful and something which is often neglected." She's very committed to her culture and her heritage and seemingly thought about it frequently. "These conflicting feelings seem impossible to reconcile. This is the ache of the diaspora." However, I think community members like Dr. Jones, like Marilyn McConney, like Dorothy Wills, demonstrate that we can serve our people and contribute to our communities anywhere in the world. The legacy they have left for future generations of those of Caribbean descent in Canada really speaks for itself. The Black Theatre Workshop, for example, still exists today. It is because Dr. Jones was ambitious and bold as she was that an undergraduate student from Belize at a majority white university was able to read a book of poetry and see herself in it and feel less alone in the inherently exclusive and isolating world of Western academia.
Thank you so much to Shanice for that very impactful readings, and to Jayda and Avryl for highlighting for us the politics of refusal, and the interdisciplinarity of her work, some of the themes that I hope to pick up on. What I wanted to do is to just give you a little bit of background, starting with Trinidad, as to how Barbara Althea Jones' analysis that we see in poetry might have been shaped. So from the poetry readings that we've had, we know that she describes the landscape here as a cold and bitter land, bodies black and bodies white, hillocks of hate and hurtful bigotry. A land that is, quote, barren of thought, tree-like in winter, brown branches of decay, the gloom, limbs out to catch us, but we must run, unquote. So what is the landscape that might have shaped her commitment to speak out against the racism that she confronted in Canada? And I want to start with the land of her birth, Trinidad, because I don't want to engage in that erasure of place that sometimes happens when we tell a story from the global north. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, the Caribbean was where the world first encountered each other. It was a place where colonizers imposed and perfected hierarchies of racial difference and domination, and it was the place that Barbara Jones was born in 1936 in Princestown, South Trinidad. And this is a postcard of the landscape around Princestown, taken from the UE archives. The population of Princestown is, as she describes in her poem West India, quite diverse. It's also an area, as you can see in the postcard, where the defining feature is the sugarcane fields, as well as, it's a bit blurry here, but in the background, there's the big house of the sugar estate. So we have the big house looming over the cane fields. And this would have been the infrastructure of white privilege that surrounded her as a child. This image is from the 1930s, so the decade of her childhood. I'd also like to share some other images of Trinidad in the 1930s so that we could ground ourselves in what it must have been like for her growing up in Trinidad at that time. And the images I'm about to show you come from R.B. Thompson's archives at the University of Toronto, and specifically from his Reflections of a Canadian Botanist in the Tropics. So here's an image of, quote, payday on a sugar estate, unquote. And again, you see the cane fields, housing that I assume is part of the sugar estate administration, and the workers lining up. We see the thatched roofs that Jayda mentioned. This would have been the botanist and his wife here posing for a photograph and posing again. So you can take note here of the way people were posed, for the reflections of white Canadian tourists, academic tourists, going to the Caribbean. This image, for example, in the archive is labeled on the back, Traveler's Palm, so referring to the tree, but not the person, very deliberately posed next to the academic and his wife. This is an image of the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture, set up in 1921 to train tropical planters and colonial agricultural officers. And you can see here almost all, if not all, are white men. So this is 1929, 1930. And then this image here shows Barbara Jones in the center. This is from her niece, her graduating class from sorry, I didn't put the year. No, 52? 52? Yeah. Oh, okay. We'll come back to that so we have it correct. Oh, sorry. I do have it. She graduated in 1958, right, with a BSc in agricultural botany. And then she went on to complete her PhD at Cornell in plant genetics. So we might wonder then, how did plants speak to Jones? And also, how did plants speak to others before her? The cane fields are a cultivated plantation. It's a sign of European mastery over a state of nature, including people. But plants also exceed agricultural commerce. The plants surrounding Jones in her early years could have been grown for medicinal purposes, for nutritional value, for spiritual purposes. So growing up in this context, we know that the landscape influenced her. So after Cornell, she moves to Montreal in the 60s. Montreal in the 60s was a place where the Queen Elizabeth Hotel refused to hire a Black Caribbean nurse, where there were no Black bus drivers or Black school principals. And in fact, up until this point, jobs were mainly confined to the railroads as working as a porter, if you were a man, or as a domestic worker if you were a woman. So in the 60s, things begin to open up a bit with the introduction of the immigration point system. And we see international students as well as Black professors coming to Montreal and contributing to the decolonial moment. This decolonial moment includes the Congress of Black Writers in 1968 and the Sir George Williams University student protest against institutional racism in 1969. So Montreal was very much a part of Black liberation struggles out of necessity. Yet despite a long history of entanglements, beginning with the transatlantic slave trade and colonial trade and then Black power, Canada is often not seen as part of this networked geography of Blackness. Blackness is associated with elsewhere, such as the Caribbean. Canada's quintessential construction as a land of snow suggests the Great White North, the purity of untouched land, a settler colonial imagination, a winter wonder landscape, all far distanced from the tropics. This geographical imagination is both a deliberate separation and an erasure of connections between Canada and the Caribbean. For example, under colonial rule, one of the notions perpetrated by Western ontologies was that Western geography, including flora and fauna, was meaningful to all. The poet Kamau Brathwaite foregrounds the insidious nature of colonial pedagogies in the Caribbean. School children taught about snow through imported textbooks rather than the surrounding local environment and landscape. However, Brathwaite shares a creative way in which a child reconciles this foreign imaginary and makes it her own. A schoolgirl writes, quote, "The snow is falling on the cane fields," unquote. The pain fields, as Brathwaite says. Another example of a landscape of pain might be Trinidad's botanical gardens, established in 1818 by the British to study plants, although only 13% of the plants there were indigenous. The Trinidadian writer V.S. Naipaul, thinking about the botanical gardens, says, "Our landscape was manufactured as that of any great French or English park, but we walked in a garden of hell, among trees some still without popular names, whose seeds had sometimes been brought to our island in the intestine of slaves." Plants are botany, history, poetry, a language that requires scrutiny to be rescued from the naturalized colonial veil where European ideologies and economic systems are universalized without acknowledging the colonial relationships of power. So I just wanted to present some of these images for us to contextualize the rage that Jones expresses as a, quote, plant geneticist communicating in verse, unquote, about the campus and the surrounding nature. Thank you.
My slides? Well, I'm waiting just to say, like, if there's one thing we can do to bring writers back, this is it. To be able to kind of hear their works literally voiced, you know, to hear such a powerful context from, I guess, you know, we think of that separation between her lives, her professional life, that she had to all the time assert that she was both a plant geneticist and a poet, and you've just made the connections between that seem so relevant, and, you know, what that would have meant for her and her Caribbean imagination. And then the amazing research that Jayda and Avryl have done, just incredible research to see her literally coming up to the surface through your work is just so exciting. So thank you, and thank you to Miranda for inviting me and all of us to be able to take part in this. So I can do it without slides also.
You can just re-download the PowerPoint.
Okay.
And then we'll open it and we'll be good. Perfect. Looks good.
And apologies for taking my glasses on and off. I'm about to get very focused, but I haven't got there yet. I just never have time to choose a frame. So the context I'm going to talk about more is as a literary historian. Great.
Okay.
It needs to cool down for a moment. Oh, okay, fine.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess what does it mean to be a literary historian of the Anglophone Caribbean? It really means a commitment to doing a lot of recovery work, because the accounts that we have are very partial, and they're inflected by both racialized and gendered dominances and hierarchies, which Nalini has spoken about. And I guess that for me personally, one of the things that's bothered me really all of my career since I studied Caribbean literature in the mid-1980s was the missing women of the mid-century. And I talk about this as an effect of broken records, and I mean that in two senses. The first is that broken record that goes around and around and around because it's broken. And that version is the version that we read of mid-century Anglophone Caribbean literary history, which is what you'll often read of as the Windrush generation. So this is a history which is told of male writers who migrated to what was seen as the metropolitan motherland. So they come to London, and there are a lot of accounts that talk, Ken Ramchand talks about London as the literary capital of the Caribbean during this period. And there are accounts by the writers themselves. So Roger May says, you know, the West Indian writer was a gambling man with a manuscript or two in his backpack. So there's a very kind of masculine version of the migrant writer. And then the other thing that's associated with that is the novel form. So some of you may know this, but Naipaul didn't want to write a novel. Basically, Diana Athill, his agent, told him that she wouldn't give him a contract to Andre Deutsch for short stories. He had to write a novel. So this sort of way in which our understanding of this literary history, of this kind of what's seen as a foundational literary history, is very much a partial one, and very much one shaped by the desires of the institutional desires that are entangled with colonialism. And actually there was a cluster of anthologies published in the 1960s, which were produced mainly with the boom of educational publishing around the mid-60s too. But they had not a single piece of writing in them by an Anglophone Caribbean woman, like not one across them. So the kind of complete sort of erasure of their voices was very, very significant. And I think really invisibility was presumed as loss. It wasn't lost, but it was presumed to be lost. So when I was taught, I was actually taught this kind of belatedness, a model of belatedness. Oh, the women came later. They started publishing in the 80s. Or sometimes we were told about Crick Crack Monkey, but that was like the first piece of writing by a Caribbean woman. And I have to say, you know, at the time, my feminist politics made me think all kinds of cuss words that I won't share with you now. That couldn't be true. If the men were writing, I knew that the women were writing too. But how was I going to find them? And I did gradually find them. I did my PhD on women writers in Jamaica before 1950. And everyone commiserated me because there was such a flourishing of contemporary writing at the time. Everyone kept saying, you seem like a nice person. Why do you want to do that? But so this sort of idea of what's worth reading as well comes into that. So I guess I had lots and lots of names. And I would literally transcribe these in Word documents, and they gradually got migrated from kind of, you know, those big floppy disks onto like pen drives and institutional servers. But I couldn't find out anything about who these women were. And I felt like I didn't want to repeat their anonymity. I didn't want to bring them into the historical record until I knew who they were. And it was very, very slow research to get there. So eventually in 2017, like this is 30 years after my PhD, this is how slow it was. I've got a lot of money from the Leverhulme Trust to run a research project called Caribbean Literary Heritage, which I know sounds like dust in the mouth, but that's how you get money. And this project really had lots of parts, and I hope, oh, maybe the address isn't on there, but it's just www.caribbeanliteraryheritage.com. And the project really was about trying to find some of these writers to expand a literary history, to map literary archives, because I was very, very aware, and as we can see with the case of Jones, that a lot of writers' papers are scattered. Now, often because of the diasporic nature of a lot of Caribbean lives, they're scattered across different continents. Here, they're scattered across different repositories. So that we produced, a postdoc on the project produced a literal map where you can find writers' papers. And what I thought would be the easiest thing to do, but turned out to be the hardest, was to write Wikipedia entries for these writers, because the notability criteria are so attached to the sort of validation models and techniques that, you know, if you're already lost, then how can you be found if the validation models ask you to appear all in the places where you've been lost from, where all the records have been broken from? So, but still, I've got a draft entry for Jones, and I'm hoping I'll be able to get it up soon. So, so my own engagement with Jones came when I was contacted by a bookseller in Barbados, for whom I am a very good customer, and knows that I will buy almost anything he tells me he has, which has been published and written by a mid-century Caribbean writer, but particularly excitedly if it's a woman. So he contacted me in like September 2020 and said, I've got this book of poems called Among the Potatoes. Nalini, could you just grab my copy? And I was like, yeah, I'll have it. I didn't see it or anything. I was, yeah, definitely, I'll have that. And I Googled then and could find nothing about it whatsoever. So I think this was about August or September 2020. And then in 2022, I was contracted to write a book, which is just about to come out, called Lost and Found, an A to Z of neglected writers. And I was very, very conscious, actually, despite the dominance of Trinidad and Anglophone histories, we didn't have a Trinidadian writer. The good version of that is that they're not missing. The bad version of that is that some of the major newspaper archives burned and we can't find them. And so by then I sort of said, well, I've got a J, Barbara Jones, but I don't think I'll be able to write hardly anything on her. I don't know anything about her. Ha ha. So I then went back to Google, and I found Aaron McHattie's 2020 blog. So Aaron was working at the archives in McGill and wrote a blog about Jones, particularly actually about her importance professionally and her academic first and achievements and her status as, you know, the first woman to gain a PhD in this, you know, woman of African descent to gain a PhD, the first Caribbean woman hired as a professor within the institution. And so I contacted Erin and said, would you like to write the entry? And she said, well, don't really know that much about poetry. And then I contacted Nalini, who I've known for a long time and who I knew was working on Montreal. And together we worked on the entry. And I went to colleagues at the University of the West Indies Archives, who I've worked with for a long time, and they were able to share student records and newspaper articles that still show that Jones was in touch with people in Trinidad. She was spoken about. Her death was reported very angrily about, we're responsible for this. You know, there was no need for her to leave Trinidad if we had behaved properly in terms of recognizing who she was. So there's a different story there, which is quite interesting to tell as well. And I went on secondhand searches for her other publications, some of which I found, contacted her family via Nalini, found David Austin's really important reparative gesture that, you know, we know that Jones was not a speaker at the Congress of Black Writers, but you make her speak in that volume and allow her space to speak. So suddenly there were all these vectors, and Jones was happily everywhere, and I was able to write with Nalini and Erin quite a long entry. And that's really important because there is a kind of wider context of loss that continues. So this is the table of contents for the A to Z, but the interesting thing here, this is the entry on Barbara Althea Jones. This is a list here of all the women's names, the names of women writers from the Anglophone Caribbean who were broadcast on the Caribbean Voices programme or published in BIM, the little magazine that came out of Trinidad, or the Beacon, the magazine that came out of, BIM out of Barbados, Beacon out of Trinidad, Kaiko Varel from Guyana, and Focus in Jamaica. And these are all women's names that we still know nothing about. So that context of loss is still quite colossal. So to be able to really bring Jones back in feels really important. And it was actually only once we'd written this entry that we found out about the work that Miranda, Avryl, and Jayda were doing within Poetry Matters. Now, you may think that, as Jones said, in academia's mediocrity, we might think, oh, how dare they, this is mine. Quite the opposite. So I think one of the really important things is not to get tangled up in that privatized version of the humanities. You know, this is about knowledge justice work. This is about us being able to bring these writers into view and share and, you know, bring everything that we have to enrich our understanding of their place and their importance. So I won't say too much really about her poetry, other than I think it's really, Among the Potatoes is a really interesting collection because, as you could tell from Shanice's reading, it's very much about those anguished entanglements between kind of personal experience and the politics that shapes personal experience. And she gestures, there are lots of gestures in there that fit within a Caribbean literary tradition. So there's quite a lot of like naming of flora and fauna and actually kind of recognizing a landscape of belonging as well as a landscape of hostility. And the land I love, land I hate, that kind of ambivalence as well. And there's a kind of, I guess, that what feels uncomfortable, unexpected and uneven political commitments. The first poem in the collection is to Winston Churchill. But I guess in the historical context, you know, there was the West Indian struggle with empire against fascism, as well as then the struggle against empire, against racism. So it's a really interesting collection in which I think we can position it kind of in its beginning to name the struggle here, the anti-racist struggle here in Canada, that long tradition of Caribbean writing, and also a kind of what really struck me when Shanice was talking was this kind of aesthetic I think she's developing around a kind of chromatography, all of the colours, which is obviously about racism and the racialization, but also I thought a kind of almost a scientific aesthetic as well, her kind of her scientific eye coming in. So I'm not going to say much more about that now, but obviously it's very clear that what feels like quite a variegated sensibility in this collection becomes much more galvanized and clarified by becoming involved in the anti-racist struggle here in Canada and the context of the 1960s in Montreal. And I suppose what we can see now that she couldn't see was how her writing dovetails with other Caribbean writings. So 1967, the year that this was published, was Kamau Brathwaite's Rite of Passage, which was the first in his trilogy, which obviously was such an important publication in terms of validating that connection that she so powerfully advocates between Africa and the Caribbean. Austin Clarke's, again, The Meeting Point, the first of his trilogy, published in 1967, which so clearly articulates that kind of connection between the Caribbean and Canada. 1967, V.S. Naipaul's The Mimic Men, that really shows, you know, what that colonial culture, how it seeps into affective life, and the injurious nature of that. And 1967, critically, is Mervyn Morris on Reading Louise Bennett Seriously. So this, you know, Jayda, when you were talking about the dialect, when she says, you know, that's her preference. So 67 is really the year that Mervyn Morris says, you know, this is serious poetry. So this whole calibration of what's worthy of attention, what's worthy of poetry. So some of those reviews, when they kind of say like, oh, well, the performance was good, but it's not really poetry. This version, you know, this kind of idea that's circulating between what can be validated as poetry. She writes exactly into that moment where all of these texts are just kind of refusing, recalibrating, rewriting what writing can do. And the gender condescension is still there. So, you know, when you say the reference to girls, so that is happening not just here in Canada. So in 1973, Nalini, can you just pass me the on air? 1973, Anson Gonzalez, who was a very important Trinidadian kind of writer, but also somebody who gave a platform to other writers in Trinidad through print and radio show. He publishes some of his radio broadcasts here, and in this collection we've got kind of first of the big timers, Sam Selvon, King of the Hillock, V.S. Naipaul, an adopted son, Derek Walcott, a man from the South, Michael Anthony, and then, wait for it, Women's Whirl, our lady writers. So this kind of way in which the diminutive kind of nature and framing, and here he calls Barbara Jones our top poetess. So there's this real acknowledgement of her. At the same time, it can only be framed in this really kind of diminutive and kind of gendered gesture. So what can we do to restore Jones? I guess this is my kind of parting gesture really to all of us, is obviously this is wonderful. I think it's about creating the conditions for her to be discovered. Discoverability seems to me one of the big challenges of our time. You know, everything we look up now, we get the, you know, a particular version of it. What can we do to make sure that she appears as in the fullness that we would like her to be known, to be recognized, to be read? So maybe a republication of her works, because now we have a much fuller version of that. Connect her papers. So I was talking today to Avryl and Jayda about putting an entry on Jones's papers onto the collections register, so somebody who's researching her would know where they could navigate her different papers, and you know where writing is in Trinidad about her. A Wikipedia entry. You know, it's such an important thing to actually put people out in that Creative Commons and to see, actually how the response is. My own experience of doing it Wikipedia entries is you find the other people who care about what you care about, often in a contestatory way, which is fabulous, but you find them, and to really keep her connected to the cultural and political ecosystems, which gave such kind of life to her work. So very grateful to be part of this and to feel like collectively we're bringing Barbara Jones back into view. So thank you.
So the first question that I have, leading from what you were saying, is about archival process and archival surprises. Because a lot of what Poetry Matters has been doing as we've been pursuing this research is thinking about the process of research, not only what it takes to find, what it takes to contextualize so as to read, and that's what everyone has been talking about. And I'm just interested in what comes to mind as you think through the process of discovery and reading the significance of Jones's work. What has surprised you most in your discoveries? Because I'm thinking about the expectations that any of us, when researching, bring to bear on what we find, especially as we build a body of materials that we're discovering, and then you'll come upon something sometimes that just runs against the grain of what you've come to expect, and then that can be what feels like a kind of turnabout in thinking. As sort of catalyzed by that archival find. I'm speaking to my own process, I guess, as I think about the other work that I do in modern poetry. What comes to mind when I ask that question about those moments of startle where you think, not only, oh, I haven't seen that before, but that was not what I expected, and then you reflect on what you have come to expect of this artist, of this writer.
Jump in, maybe.
Okay.
I think. I think that we can both speak to this, but one thing that was really very interesting for us was because obviously the archives at McGill are predominantly Jones's work in the science, and so it was interesting, I think, reading through all of those notes with the lens of wanting to learn about her literary work and her artistic work. And noticing the things that you notice that you wouldn't otherwise maybe notice. Yeah. I think at first both Jayda and I were perhaps sometimes asking ourselves what we were doing when we were reading about pages and pages about potatoes. But then you would find a little note in the margin, like you had mentioned, I hate snow.
I hate snow.
Yeah. Or a sketch of a dress or her professors or something. And it was really, even other materials, there's one paper that mentions that she had a heifer named Helveta when she was in Trinidad. So it's just all of these little features that you find doing that kind of research that really paint a person for you that's more than just what you would read when you do traditional for us, I guess, kinds of research today, just online. So that wasn't so specific to Jones, but I guess her archive really draws that out because she was working in such different areas.
May I just follow up on that and say that it's interesting that you feel as if you were building some expectations about the kind of thing that you would find from what you were discovering online. And maybe sometimes there was an artifact or an object or a doodle that you found that didn't.
I think part of it too for me was I think today something like this kind of research where science and art is so much together. Yeah. You have this sense that they maybe shouldn't be almost, because I think that's kind of how we think today at university. You specialize and you don't engage with the other. Yeah. And so it was interesting to try to not think in that way and realize that we do have to read through all of this science stuff if we want to learn about who she was as an artist, and that she explicitly is showing us to do that because Among the Potatoes is a very thing.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
For that reason, the World poem that was read is very interesting as well. There's a line that maybe later on I can ask Nalini about, but that it ends with, the world is black and white and green. And black and white, you think political, racial, and then there's green, which refers to like a nature element. So I don't know, I'm curious about, I'm still don't quite understand how these things fuse together, but I'm curious to know what you think. But back to the original question, I feel like what surprised me most was less about like Jones herself and more about what the archival process can look like. I think I went into it expecting like deadness and like just, I don't know, tedious work, and there was a lot of that. But
Archival tedium,
yeah. There was a lot of that, but it was also fun. Like we had to follow leads, and me and Avryl have our bulletin board where we like trace. We had to talk to people, and even when it was like a dead end, it was still, I don't know, it was a learning experience. We were building skills, we were making connections, even if we don't use information now, we can use it later, that kind of thing. It was a very vibrant and lively process, and it felt so collaborative. Now we know so many more people in lots of different areas that we wouldn't have known before that we can reach out to now if we have questions about certain things.
I guess also what really struck me about what you said then was this temptation for archival research to be kind of selective and even extractive, you know, to go in to get what you need to do the work you need to do rather than just to spend time with what there is. And, you know, I think that that's what you've really done so brilliantly was to spend time with what there is and really try to read it for its fullness rather than thinking, okay, we're looking at this, let's take that out. And it seems to me that that's often what happens with archival research. And so, you know, you can go back to an archive somebody else has looked at and you think, but they never mentioned this person was in there or that event was in there because there's, you know, their purpose was to go there. And I think that that's an obligation we have as researchers, is to really pay attention to the character of the archive, and certainly with something like the funds that you have here, which are so organic because they literally were her papers, you know, that to work with that. And also perhaps to have that commitment to enrich the archive, to actually help the archive accrue itself, you know, when there are broken records, to bring things back into view, to mirror or connect or recognise, so that there is a kind of reparative dimension.
Yeah. Well, and what you're speaking to also is that kind of immersion that is often necessary, that you have to stay with the materials. Yeah.
I guess I would like to congratulate Jayda and Avryl for the incredible work that they've done in following the threads found at the McGill archives that led to Musée des Beaux-Arts, to the Canadian Jewish archives, to mainstream media, as well as to student newsletters, and just the abundance of information that you found. I suppose that would be the surprise element for me. One of the questions I'm left with in thinking about your presentation, Alison, is I wonder if Barbara Jones would have defined herself as a feminist in those days. So many of the women that in 2019 we organized a 50th anniversary of the Sir George Williams student occupation, and we had a roundtable with many of the women protesters from those days who were quite adamant that they were not feminists. They didn't define themselves as feminists, but the students, the young women in the audience, did see them as feminists and did take from their histories feminist lessons. And I just wonder if Barbara Jones was with us, how she would position herself.
Yeah, that's deeply interesting that they didn't want to come forward as feminist. Let me ask another question that will call upon what you have recognized in the work that you've been doing with Jones's work. I know that Jayda and Avryl and I were very mindful of certain lines of development or evolution in her poetry that we began to notice as we were moving from Among the Potatoes to a couple of additional poems that we found in other venues. So it made me think more generally about development and even turning points that you might have noticed in Jones's thought and work. And you've spoken to a couple of these in what you brought forward, but I wonder what comes to mind most readily when you think about that. If you think about what you're aware of how Jones's work in poetry and in the arts and performance, where you might identify junctures at which something changes direction, I guess, if anything comes to mind.
I guess I would say that in terms of her sense of audience. So
Yeah.
Among the Potatoes was published by Arthur Stockwell in Devon, and we suspect that probably Jones self-published it and then gave copies to people who she wanted to have it. So actually it's quite a privatized gesture. Often the volumes are dedicated to somebody or they're given to friends. So the circulation was very curated very much by her personal sense of with whom she wanted to share, whereas clearly when she starts to do the work, the public work, and write in newspapers, there's a very clear sense there that she has something to speak out about,
Yes.
and that this is a very, I think that her sense of who she's writing to
Yes.
really changes.
Yeah, I would say something very similar. I agree. I think that specifically African, the Caribbean, and uptight to New Registered as kind of turning points, in that this is poetry that's very much not just page poetry, it's poetry that's being performed with music and with dancing, and for African, the Caribbean afterwards, she even had some visual art showed on display for a few days after the performance. So it's interesting too, because I think that at the same time as her poetry becomes more public-facing, it also starts engaging more, it seems to me, maybe not, also in Among the Potatoes, but in politics and also in her work with plants. Like it's kind of like all of these things felt like they were coming together. With what we've heard of that. Of course, we don't have a script of either of this, so we can't know exactly. But yeah, yes.
Yeah, and I don't know, I feel like 67, 68, 69 are very politically charged times, so I feel like there has to be a shift in energy there. But
Yeah, I just a note on wording that Jayda and Avryl, you drew attention to, that on the CV, she always places her work in genetics as that of vocation, and that she places the work in poetry as that of avocation. And does that shift? You know, does her sense of what poetry can do shift in that way? Why don't I turn things over to you? You may have comments and questions for one another.
I feel like I would just go back to my earlier question, and it's fine if you don't have an answer, because I don't have an answer. But yeah, I'm just really curious about, I feel like maybe it's simpler than I'm making it out to be, but the title Among the Potatoes fuses those worlds of science and art, which I feel like as an English student, I'm used to viewing them very separately. And I go back to the poem The World. The world is black and white and green, full of potato plants, it seems. So it seems to be talking about racial dynamics, but then there's also potato plants involved, and I wonder what you might make of that, considering your presentation earlier, but totally fine if you have an answer.
I think the landscape in Trinidad is sedimented upon race, and I think that's what I hope I was trying to pull out, and I think shaped her thinking in relation to just growing up in a society where the plantation industrial complex dominated the landscape, dominated the use of plants, and yet there was always spaces that the plots that you could carve out for agency and independence of thinking. And I don't know if she would have framed it in that way, but that's what I take away from her poetry. Did you want to add?
I mean, I guess she uses colour a lot, but that black and white is very, very clearly there, isn't it? That, as you say, is the foundation. Is the foundational kind of monochrome of experience, I think. But as a poet, she's making that effort to witness those other colours, to extend that kind of aesthetic and bring, but without ever kind of dismissing that foundational monochrome, I think. So.
Well, it's 2 seconds. I was going to add to that, and it was interesting for both of us, I think, when we were reading the plant genetics work. I think we come to it with the lens, of course, of the humanities, but like there would be like little notes. Like I remember one particular was racist, maybe defined as Mendelian, and it's like she could have just copied that from her lecture notes. We don't know, but it does show the ways in which like she was thinking across these boundaries, just in lectures at Cornell. So it's another interesting thread that you get.
No, I was gonna say that I feel like that's extremely helpful. Because I think at first I was viewing her work in the genetics as maybe a break from having to engage so politically with her work in comparison to the stuff that she does in theater and poetry, but even that is very politically charged, so that makes sense.
Can I just ask a follow-up question to that then? As students, what do you find useful politically in her work to think with? What do you find subversive or, maybe a turning point?
I think that oftentimes, of course, we come to these situations with our own experiences, and often it's hard to separate that from the research that you're doing. But I think for me, like her work in agriculture was really interesting, and also being a professor at a university and also being an artist. I'm also from a rural area in southern Ontario, so it was neat to see. I mean, I think of a poem like Academia or something, and just seeing how she was navigating those very different spaces was very fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think I just really admire the way that she refuses to be put into any kind of one box. Even my difficulty with kind of fusing together her work in the sciences with arts is a testament to that. She was, there's one article, poet geneticists, what is it? Poet, geneticist, artist, something like that.
She's all three
combined, and I think that speaks very much to, I don't know, her interdisciplinary outlook on the world. And I also like that, yes, she's engaging in political discourse and all of that, but she does it in a way I feel is very true to her and her outlook on life. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it might be a Black man in a white society. She speaks to the state of racial politics in Canada, and she says something towards the end, not a perfect quote, but something along the lines of racism is a waste of human resources, and I just thought it was a very scientific way of seeing racism and why it's a negative thing, but yeah.
It's a hot potato.
Miranda, do you want? Well, I'm thinking that we might draw this segment to a close, and with thanks. Thank you to all of you for bringing forward the work that you're doing and gesturing toward what's next in the work here. So what we will do is draw the recording segment to a conclusion, and then there may be some questions, comments from others here. But thank you all very much, and thank you again to Rare Books and Special Collections at McGill and McGill University Archives for making this space possible. So thank you.